Hello and welcome back to Cluster Fudge, the podcast where we take tangled issues and unravel the chaos with honesty, depth, and just a touch of fire. I'm your host, Alexandra, and today we're diving headfirst into one of the most controversial, emotionally charged, and morally complex topics in modern society: the death penalty. That's right, capital punishment, the ultimate sentence, the state-sanctioned ending of a life. Some call it justice. Others call it vengeance. And many ask, is it ever truly necessary? Is it even ethical? And does it actually work? Buckle up. This isn't going to be easy, but it's necessary. Let's begin at the foundation. Before we can examine the ethics, the implications, and the consequences, we have to understand what the death penalty actually is. And more importantly, why it continues to exist in a country that claims to value life, justice, and liberty. The death penalty, also known as capital punishment, is the legal killing of a person by the state as punishment for a crime. It is the most extreme, most irreversible action a government can take against one of its citizens. And in theory, it's reserved for the worst of the worst, the so-called monsters among us, serial killers, mass murderers, terrorists. But the practice of executing people is not new. It dates back thousands of years to ancient Babylon, where a legal code listed the death penalty for 25 different crimes, including theft. In ancient Rome, executions were public spectacles, often cruel, often theatrical, and almost always political. The guillotine in France, hangings in 18th century England, firing squads in various military regimes. The death penalty has evolved, though, but it has never truly disappeared. Fast forward to today, while much of the developed world has abolished capital punishment, the United States remains one of the few Western democracies that still practices it. We're on a very short list, alongside countries like China, Iran, North Korea, and Saudi Arabia, when it comes to the frequency and consistency of executions. Let that sink in for a moment. As of 2025, 27 US states retain the death penalty as part of their criminal justice systems. 23 states plus Washington, D.C. have formally abolished it. 3 states, California, Oregon, and Pennsylvania, currently have moratoriums, meaning the governors have paused executions even though the laws technically still allow them. But here's where things get interesting. Not all states that have the death penalty actually use it. In many places, it's more symbolic than functional, a dusty relic that politicians reference but rarely enforce. Then there are states like Texas, Florida, Missouri, and Alabama, which still actively carry out executions, sometimes multiple in a single year. So why the divide? Why do some states cling to it while others have walked away? The reasons people give. When supporters are asked why the death penalty should exist, the responses usually fall into one of 3 categories. 1, retribution. The eye for an eye. Argument. This is the emotional core of the pro-death penalty stance. The belief that if someone takes a life, they deserve to lose theirs in return. It's about moral balance, justice, closure. For many, it feels like the only punishment that's equal to the crime. But this isn't justice in the legal sense, it's justice in the emotional sense. It's vengeance, it's payback. And while that may feel satisfying on a human level, we have to ask, should our laws reflect our anger or our principles? Deterrence, the idea that it prevents future crimes. This is a more pragmatic argument. Proponents say, if people know they could die for committing certain crimes, they'll think twice before doing them. But, as we'll explore later in this episode, the evidence for deterrence is deeply flawed and widely disputed. In fact, many criminologists argue that it doesn't deter violent crime at all, especially crimes of passion or desperation, which are the most common types of murders. 3. Closure for victims' families. This is perhaps the most emotionally complex reason. When someone loses a loved one to murder, the pain is unimaginable. Supporters argue that the execution of the perpetrator can bring a sense of finality, a sense of peace. But that peace is far from guaranteed. Many families of victims report that the years of trials, appeals, delays, and media attention only prolong their suffering. And for some, the execution brings no relief, only another layer of trauma, a political weapon. Let's also be real. The death penalty isn't just about justice or public safety. It's a political tool. Tough-on-crime rhetoric wins elections. Politicians often use support for the death penalty as a way to appear strong, decisive, and protective of public order, even if the policy is outdated, ineffective, or morally bankrupt. Capital punishment becomes a talking point more than a solution, and that's dangerous because when something as serious as state-sanctioned death becomes a soundbite, we lose sight of the human cost. Here's the hard truth. We still have the death penalty in America, not because it works, but because it lingers. Because we haven't built a criminal justice system that consistently values fairness over fury. Because it's easier to stick with the old, broken ways than to take the political risk of doing something better. And because for some, the illusion of justice matters more than the reality of injustice. The death penalty persists because as our culture, our politics, and our sense of morality are still deeply divided. And perhaps because we haven't asked the right questions loudly enough or often enough. So let's move to the next pillar that props up the death penalty in modern America: deterrence. The idea that executing criminals will stop others from committing similar crimes. That fear of death, the ultimate punishment, will be enough to make someone say, maybe I shouldn't do this. It sounds logical. It even sounds comforting. But is it true? Let's pull that thread and see what unravels. The theory of deterrence, a simple premise. At its core, the deterrence theory goes like this. Open quote. If the punishment is severe enough, rational people will avoid committing crimes to escape the consequences. Close quote. The death penalty is seen as the maximum deterrent because it's irreversible. Proponents argue that by making an example of those who commit heinous crimes can scare others straight. But here's the issue. Criminal behaviour isn't always rational, especially violent crime. Murders, especially the kinds that typically lead to the death penalty, are rarely planned with cool calculation. They're often driven by emotion, mental illness, rage, addiction, desperation, or even sheer impulse. In many cases, the perpetrator isn't thinking about getting caught, let alone calculating which state has the harshest punishment. So if someone's not acting rationally, what good is a rational deterrent? The research, what does the data say? You would think that with such a high-stakes punishment, there'd be overwhelming evidence that it works as a deterrent. Nope, quite the opposite. The National Research Council reviewed decades of studies and concluded there is no credible evidence that the death penalty has any measurable effect on homicide rates. A study by the American Civil Liberties Union showed that states with the death penalty often have higher murder rates than those without it. The FBI Uniform Crime Report routinely shows that southern states, which execute more people than any other region, also have the highest murder rates in the country. Meanwhile, the Northeast, which uses the death penalty the least, consistently has the lowest. If capital punishment worked as a deterrent, you'd expect the exact opposite trend. But we don't see that. Not even close. Human behaviour is more complex than fear of punishment. Here's a truth that often gets ignored in political soundbites. Open quote, criminals are not deterred by punishments they don't think they'll face. Close quote. In other words, what actually deters crime is not the severity of the punishment, but the certainty of getting caught. Most people who commit murder don't think they'll be arrested, convicted, or sentenced, let alone executed. They don't expect to be the one who gets caught. That's just human psychology. So even if the punishment is death, if the criminal doesn't expect to face it, how can it be a deterrent? In fact, law enforcement professionals, the very people tasked with preventing and solving violent crimes, largely agree that the death penalty doesn't help them do their jobs. A nationwide survey of police chiefs found that they ranked the death penalty last among crime-fighting tools. What did they say would actually help? More officers, better training, stronger community relationships, improved mental health services, and better economic conditions, not executions. Death penalty versus life without parole. Any difference? Some proponents argue that even if the death penalty doesn't deter all criminals, it must at least be more effective than a life sentence. Let's test that. In terms of public safety, Life without parole offers the same functional outcome. The offender is permanently removed from society and will never have the opportunity to commit another crime outside of prison. So if both punishments achieve the same result, keeping dangerous individuals from reoffending, then why choose the more expensive, more flawed, and more ethically complex option? Unless the goal isn't deterrence at all, but something else. Vengeance, perhaps, or political theatre. The appeal of a myth. So why does the myth of deterrence persist? Because it's emotionally satisfying. It feels like justice. It sounds tough. It gives politicians something to point to when they're asked what they're doing to stop crime. But feelings aren't facts, and slogans don't equal solutions. The truth is this. There's no reliable evidence that the death penalty deters violent crime more effectively than life imprisonment, and yet we continue to invest time, money, and moral capital in a tool that doesn't do what its supporters claim it does. Why? Because it allows us to pretend we're doing something, because it's easier to scare people into thinking we're being tough on crime than it is to admit we need a complete overhaul of our justice system. The real deterrence. If we're serious about preventing violent crime, then we need to focus on what actually works. Investing in early childhood education and poverty reduction, improving access to mental health and addiction services, building trust between communities and law enforcement, increasing the speed and certainty of legal consequences. Not necessarily the severity. These things aren't as flashy as the death penalty. They don't make headlines, but they work. Coming up next, we'll explore how deeply broken and deeply biased the death penalty system really is, because not everyone who lands on death row is guilty, and not everyone gets there the same way. Stay with me. Let's talk about a truth that makes many people uncomfortable, but needs to be said, and said loudly. The death penalty is not just flawed in its logic, it is racially biased in its application. And when we say that justice is supposed to be blind, we have to ask, blind to what? Because in the case of capital punishment, it seems too often that justice is blind to fairness, blind to equality, and blind to the ugly weight of America's long history of racial discrimination. So in this segment, we're pulling back the curtain on how race and inequality infiltrate every corner of the death penalty, from who gets charged, to who gets sentenced, to who lives and who dies. A system that claims neutrality, but rarely delivers it. Let's begin by acknowledging that the US legal system presents itself as neutral. The law, as it's written, is supposed to treat everyone equally, regardless of race, wealth, gender, or status. But laws are enforced by people with biases, people influenced by politics, pressure, and prejudice. And when a system like that is entrusted with the most permanent punishment imaginable, the execution of a human being, those biases become life and death decisions. So what happens when we look at the death penalty through the lens of race? The numbers don't lie. The statistics are overwhelming and frankly horrifying. Over 40% of death row inmates in the United States are black, despite black Americans making up only about 13% of the US population. In cases where the victim is white, the defendant is far more likely to receive the death penalty than if the victim is black or Latino. A landmark study in Georgia found that defendants accused of killing white victims were over 4 times more likely to be sentenced to death than those accused of killing black victims. In Louisiana, someone accused of killing a white person is 97% more likely to be sentenced to death than someone who killed a black person. Let that sink in. It's not just who commits the crime that determines who gets the death penalty. It's who the victim was. In America, a murder victim's race carries more weight in sentencing than almost any other factor. And that's not justice. That's a legacy of racial hierarchy codified into law. Prosecutorial discretion. One of the most overlooked sources of bias in the death penalty system is prosecutorial discretion, meaning prosecutors have wide latitude in deciding which cases are pursued as capital cases and which are not. And study after study has shown that prosecutors are more likely to seek the death penalty if the defendant is black. They are also more aggressive in seeking death when the victim is white. This discretionary power is exercised behind closed doors, often without transparency and almost never with accountability. And once the charge is filed as capital, the trajectory of that case becomes dramatically different, more expensive, more adversarial, and far more likely to result in a death sentence. Jury selection, another front line of inequality. Let's talk about juries. In a death penalty case, the jury must be death qualified, meaning they must be willing to impose the death penalty if the situation calls for it. But here's the problem. Studies show that death-qualified juries tend to be disproportionately white, especially in areas with large black populations. And because prosecutors can strike potential jurors who oppose the death penalty, a stance more common among people of colour, black jurors are systematically excluded from many death penalty trials. This skews the jury pool toward a demographic that is more punitive, more conservative, and often less racially diverse. In essence, we're allowing prosecutors to construct juries that are more likely to deliver the outcome they want. That's not impartiality, that's engineering. Implicit bias and dehumanization. And we can't ignore the role of implicit bias, those subconscious attitudes and stereotypes that affect how people perceive others, even when they're trying to be fair. Numerous psychological studies have shown that black defendants are more likely to be perceived as more dangerous, less remorseful, more likely to reoffend. In one particularly chilling study, researchers found that black men with more stereotypically black facial features were more likely to be sentenced to death, even when controlling for the facts of the case. In other words, the darker your skin, the broader your nose, the more your fate may be sealed, not by what you did, but by how you look. That's not justice. That's the residue of centuries of dehumanization. Race and deadly intersection. It's impossible to talk about racial inequality in the death penalty without talking about economic inequality, because the two are deeply intertwined. Most people on death row are not just people of colour, they're also poor. They cannot afford high-powered defence attorneys, expert witnesses, or independent investigations. They rely on public defenders who are often overworked, underpaid, and under-resourced. And in capital cases, that's a death sentence in itself. Here's the brutal truth. In America, you're less likely to be executed for the crime you committed than for the lawyer you couldn't afford. That's not justice. That's a caste system in disguise. Case studies that haunt the system. Let's look at a few real-world examples that expose how bias and inequality twist the system. The case of Rodney Reed, Texas, a black man sentenced to death for the murder of a white woman. Evidence of racial bias, misconduct, and mishandled forensic evidence surrounded the case. New DNA testing and witness testimony raised serious doubts about his guilt, yet the state continued to pursue his execution. The case of Dwayne Buck, Texas. During the sentencing phase, a psychologist testified in court that Buck was more likely to be dangerous in the future because he was black. That testimony helped the jury sentence him to death. It took 17 years of appeals and public pressure before his sentence was finally changed to life in prison. These aren't rare outliers. They are reflections of how deep the cracks run and how easy it is for race to become the deciding factor between life and death. If the system is biased, the outcome can't be just Tombstubber. Here's what we have to understand. Even if you support the idea of the death penalty in theory, you have to confront the reality that in practice it doesn't play out fairly. It reflects and amplifies the inequalities already baked into our society. A truly just system cannot be built on a foundation of racial bias, economic disparity, and human error. And if we can't guarantee fairness in the most serious punishment we can impose, then we shouldn't impose it at all. Coming up next, we'll explore just how fragile our justice system really is and how easy it is to execute the wrong person. Because it's happened many times, and once it does, there's no going back. Stay with me. What should be the most sacred principle in any justice system? It's better to let a guilty person go free than to execute an innocent one. That's not just a moral stance, it's a foundational ethic of civilized law. Because the idea of justice only works if it includes fairness, due process, and the ability to correct errors. But what happens when the system doesn't get it right? What happens when an innocent person is convicted and, worse, sentenced to die? That's not just a tragic accident, that's state-sanctioned murder. And in the United States, it's not just possible, it's happened. Over and over again. The numbers. A national shame. Since 1973, at least 195 people in the United States have been exonerated after being sentenced to death. That's not speculation, that's confirmed, documented, innocent individuals who were wrongfully convicted and in many cases spent decades behind bars awaiting execution for crimes they didn't commit. That's about 1 every 8 death row cases resulting in a wrongful conviction. Let that land for a second. If a commercial airline had a 1 in 8 chance of crashing, the entire industry would be shut down. If your medication had a 1 in 8 chance of killing you, it would be pulled from the shelves. But somehow we tolerate those odds when it comes to human lives. The risk of executing even one innocent person should be enough to dismantle the system. But in America, we've turned a blind eye to that possibility, and we've let the machine keep running. Why do wrongful convictions happen? The idea that someone could be wrongfully convicted, especially in a death penalty case, is terrifying. So how does it happen? The answer is easily, and for many reasons. 1, false or coerced confessions. You might be thinking, why would someone confess to something they didn't do? But it happens all the time, especially under duress, fatigue, mental illness, or after intense manipulative interrogations. Some people are threatened, others are promised leniency, and some just want the torture to stop. Over 25% of DNA exoneration cases involved false confessions. Eyewitness testimony is one of the most persuasive pieces of evidence in court, and also one of the least reliable. The Innocence Project found that more than 70% of wrongful convictions later overturned by DNA evidence involved mistaken eyewitness identification. Memory is not a recording. It's vulnerable to suggestion, bias, and trauma. Hair analysis, bite marks, arson forensics, even lie detector tests. Many of these scientific techniques were once considered reliable in court until they were debunked or discredited as pseudoscience. But convictions and death sentences were secured based on them, and courts have been slow to reverse those convictions, even when the science changed. Some prosecutors withhold exculpatory evidence, some present knowingly false testimony, some stack charges and manipulate witnesses to force plea deals, even in death penalty cases. The pressure to secure a conviction, especially in high-profile murder cases, can lead to shortcuts, unethical practices, or outright misconduct, and the consequences are lethal. The vast majority of people sentenced to death are too poor to afford private attorneys. They rely on public defenders or court-appointed lawyers who are often underpaid, overworked, and sometimes inexperienced in capital cases. When the state has unlimited resources and your lawyer can't even hire an investigator or a single expert witness, you don't stand a chance. The courtroom becomes a rigged game. Real people, real lives, real loss. Let's put faces to this injustice. These aren't just statistics, they're human beings. Kirk Bloodsworth, a former Marine and the first American exonerated from death row through DNA evidence, wrongly convicted of the rape and murder of a 9-year-old girl, spent 8 years behind bars, 2 of them on death row. The real killer was later identified, someone whose name had been in the case files from the beginning. Carlos de Luna, executed in Texas in 1989, maintained his innocence until the end. A Columbia Law School investigation years later found compelling evidence that another man, Carlos Hernandez, committed the crime and was even known to law enforcement. But it was too late. De Luna was already gone. These cases aren't rare. They're symptoms of a broken system. And for every person we've exonerated, how many others weren't so lucky? There's no undoing an execution. This is the key problem with the death penalty. It's irreversible. If you lock up the wrong person for life, you can release them. You can apologize, you can compensate, you can try to make things right. But if you execute the wrong person, you can't say sorry. You can't bring them back. You've committed the ultimate injustice in the name of justice. And it's not a hypothetical. It's happened again and again and again. All this, and it still costs more? Here's the final insult to injury. We spend millions more pursuing the death penalty than we would if we simply sentenced people to life without parole. Think about that. we're pouring public resources into a system that kills innocent people, operates with bias, doesn't deter crime, and costs more. If you created a public policy this dangerous, this broken, and this expensive in any other sector, it would be dismantled overnight. But because it's the death penalty, we keep it alive, even if it means innocent people won't be. And beyond the dollars and the data, we must reckon with the moral cost. When we allow a system that kills the innocent, we devalue the very concept of justice. We become complicit in something we can never undo. The death penalty doesn't just risk executing the innocent, it already has. And that fact alone should shake the foundation of any argument in favour of it. Coming up next, we'll shift focus to the financial burden of capital punishment, because while many assume the death penalty saves taxpayer dollars, that couldn't be further from the truth. Stay with me. Let's talk money, because even if you're someone who isn't swayed by the moral arguments, even if you think the death penalty is justified for the worst of the worst, and even if you don't believe wrongful convictions are common, there's still one uncomfortable, undeniable truth that should give you pause. The death penalty costs taxpayers more than life in prison. A lot more. And we're not talking pennies. This system that's so often justified in the name of justice, retribution, or deterrence is also an expensive, bloated, bureaucratic nightmare that bleeds money at every stage. Let's break down exactly where the dollars go and why it's far more expensive to kill than to incarcerate. Contrary to popular belief, executing someone doesn't save money. In fact, the opposite is true. On average, a death penalty case costs taxpayers between $1 million to $3 million more than a comparable case seeking life imprisonment without parole. Death penalty cases begin with a significantly more complex and expensive trial process. Jury selection is longer and more rigorous. Prosecutors and defense teams spend weeks screening potential jurors for their views on capital punishment. Extra lawyers are required, 2 defense attorneys at minimum, often with special qualifications, and frequently an investigator and a mitigation expert. Pre-trial motions and hearings are far more extensive, involving expert witnesses and elaborate procedures. The trial itself can last months, with more witnesses, evidence reviews, forensic examinations, and legal manoeuvring than a standard criminal case. A 2008 study in Maryland found that death penalty cases cost $1 million more per case than non-death penalty cases. The appeals process in a death penalty case is mandatory, prolonged, and expensive. And rightly so, because the stakes are life and death. Direct appeals, state habeas corpus, federal habeas corpus, and clemency petitions are all part of the process. Each of these involves specialized legal teams, court personnel, and in many cases multiple rounds of hearings that can stretch for 10 to 30 years. These costs aren't just borne by the defense. The state pays for prosecutors, judges, clerks, expert witnesses, and court staff throughout. A 2016 study in Oklahoma found that death penalty appeals cost the state 3.2 times more than appeals for life sentences. 3. Death row incarceration. People on death row cost more to house than those serving life in general population. Why? Heightened security, more guards, more surveillance, more isolation. Special housing units. These aren't regular prison cells. They're high security environments designed to prevent escape or suicide. Restricted movement. Prisoners are often shackled during transport, requiring more staff time and resources. In California, death row inmates cost the state $90,000 more per year per prisoner than those in general population. Believe it or not, executing someone isn't cheap. The drugs used in lethal injections are difficult to source and have become exorbitantly expensive, especially as pharmaceutical companies increasingly refuse to supply them for executions. States have paid millions trying to import or produce execution drugs, and some have even turned to secretive, legally dubious contracts with international suppliers. On top of that, execution protocols, medical staffing, media staging, legal oversight, and security all carry significant cost, and all that effort, all that money, all that human labour for one execution. Opportunity cost. What else could that money do? Let's imagine what we could do instead of sinking millions into a flawed capital punishment system. Fund mental health treatment programs for at-risk youth. Improve forensic labs and rape kit processing backlogs. Support victim services including therapy, restitution, housing and trauma recovery. Expand public defender resources so people accused of crimes actually get fair representation. Build community-based violence intervention strategies that prevent crimes before they occur. Imagine how many lives we could save by preventing violence, instead of spending millions after it's already too late. State-level examples. The receipts. Let's talk receipts. Actual state-level studies. California has spent over $5 billion on the death penalty since 1978, has executed only 13 people in that time. That breaks down to over $384 million per execution. The state has more than 700 people on death row and is functionally incapable of executing most of them. Florida, a 2017 study estimated that Florida has spent $50 million per execution. For every $1 million spent on executions, they execute approximately 0.02 people. Not exactly efficient use of public funds. Kansas, a legislative audit found that death penalty cases cost 70% more than non-death penalty cases, even before accounting for appeals. And yet, it persists. You'd think a policy that's morally questionable, proven ineffective at deterrence, racially biased, capable of executing the innocent, and grossly more expensive, would have been tossed in the trash decades ago. But the death penalty remains, fueled by emotion, revenge politics, misinformation and fear. It's not justice. It's not fiscally responsible. It's not about safety. It's about spectacle. And the longer we cling to it, the more lives and dollars we waste. Final thought for this segment. The myth that the death penalty saves money is just that, a myth. In reality, it's a bloated, expensive failure that drains resources from the things that actually make communities safer and more just. If we're serious about public safety, victims' rights and smart budgeting, then we need to stop funding a system that doesn't work, morally, financially. Coming up next, we'll examine the global perspective on capital punishment, because it turns out the US is in shrinking company when it comes to keeping this practice alive. So far, we've talked about the death penalty within the borders of the United States, its costs, its racial inequalities, its failures, and its irreversible mistakes. But let's zoom out for a moment. Because capital punishment doesn't exist in a vacuum. We are part of a global community, and how we punish our own citizens puts us on a list that's getting shorter with each passing year. And here's the truth. The United States is one of the few democracies still holding on to the death penalty. So the question becomes, who still executes people in 2025? And why are they doing it? What does that say about us? And what direction is the world heading in? The numbers, a shrinking club. According to Amnesty International and the Death Penalty Information Center, as of 2025, more than 2/3 of the countries in the world have abolished the death penalty in law or in practice. That's over 140 nations that have either eliminated it or stopped using it. Only around 55 countries retain it in law, but fewer than 25 actually carried out executions last year. In other words, the global trend is clear. The world is moving away from state-sanctioned killing. But a few countries, including the United States, are bucking that trend. Who still executes? Let's look at the top executors in recent years. China. China executes more people than the rest of the world combined, but exact numbers are classified as a state secret. Estimates suggest thousands of executions annually, often after trials that lack transparency or fairness. Crimes punishable by death include non-violent offences like drug trafficking and corruption. The justice system is tightly controlled by the state, and due process is often absent. Iran. Iran carries out the second highest number of executions globally. Many executions are for drug-related offences, moral crimes or blasphemy. In 2023 alone, Iran executed over 800 people, often without fair trials. There are credible reports of torture, forced confessions and trials lasting mere minutes. Saudi Arabia, known for public executions and a justice system rooted in strict interpretations of Sharia law. Capital crimes include murder, apostasy, adultery, sorcery, and even social media offences. Executions can occur via beheading, stoning, or crucifixion. The state uses executions to send political and religious messages. It's as much about control as it is about law. Egypt, Singapore, Vietnam, and others, execution is still actively used in these countries, often in response to drug crimes, political dissent, or terrorism charges. In many of these nations, there's a lack of judicial transparency and no right to appeal. The United States, the only Western democracy still using the death penalty. While federal executions have paused, 27 US states retain the death penalty and executions continue at the state level. The US is often grouped with authoritarian regimes on this issue, not with its allies in the EU or Canada. It's a glaring contradiction for a country that claims to be a global human rights leader. Who has abolished it and why? Let's highlight some countries that have chosen to leave capital punishment behind and explore why. United Kingdom abolished the death penalty in 1965, cited wrongful convictions and a growing sense of moral unease with state killing, now a vocal opponent of capital punishment worldwide. South Africa abolished the death penalty in 1995 after the end of apartheid. The Constitutional Court declared it incompatible with the new democratic values of human dignity and equality. Powerful symbolism, transitioning from a regime of oppression to one of justice. Mexico abolished the death penalty in 2005, considers capital punishment a violation of human rights and will not extradite suspects to countries where they could face execution. Canada ended the death penalty for all crimes in 1998, strong public support for abolition, particularly after several high-profile wrongful conviction cases. Rwanda abolished the death penalty in 2007, even after a genocide that claimed 800,000 lives, chose reconciliation over retribution, believing that true justice couldn't be served through execution. Why do some countries hold on? So why does the death penalty persist in places like the US, China, and Iran? A few common reasons. 1. Political power and control. In authoritarian states, executions serve as tools of fear and silencing dissent. Death becomes a message: disobey the state and you die. 2. Cultural and religious beliefs. In some countries, interpretations of religious texts or traditions uphold the idea of capital punishment as morally justified, even necessary. These beliefs are often embedded in national identity or law. 3. Public opinion and populism. In democratic countries like the US, tough-on-crime rhetoric still plays well politically. Politicians often use the death penalty to signal strength, even when it's ineffective or costly. There's also a persistent myth that the public wants it, even though recent polls show growing discomfort. 4. Institutional inertia. Systems that are old, entrenched, and resistant to change often continue long after they've outlived their usefulness. The courts, law enforcement, and political systems have been built around the death penalty. Removing it means restructuring deeply rooted institutions. Global pressure. The heat is rising. The global community is starting to turn up the heat on countries that still use capital punishment. The European Union will not extradite anyone to a country where they could face execution. UN resolutions continue to call for a global moratorium on the death penalty. International watchdogs and human rights groups increasingly name and shame nations that continue executions, and yes, the US is often on that list. For a country that promotes democracy, freedom, and justice on the world stage, capital punishment remains a glaring contradiction. Final thought for this segment. The death penalty is disappearing, slowly but surely. Not because of weakness, not because criminals are getting a free pass, but because the world is evolving. Nations are realizing that justice doesn't need to kill to be strong, that human rights and public safety are not mutually exclusive, that retribution is not the same as accountability. And as the list of executioner nations grows smaller, we have to ask, why is the United States still on it? And what does that mean for our moral credibility in the 21st century? What kind of justice system do we want to be proud of? Let's take a moment to step back from the legal arguments, the statistics, the moral debates, and the political noise, and ask the simplest yet most important question of all. What kind of justice system do we want to be proud of? Because whether you support the death penalty, oppose it, or fall somewhere in the middle, one thing is universally true. Justice is supposed to reflect who we are as a society. It's a mirror a moral compass, a code of values made real in courts, prisons, and policy. So the question becomes, are we proud of what that mirror is showing us? Justice or vengeance? There is a difference, a fundamental, often forgotten difference between justice and vengeance. Justice is thoughtful. Justice is measured. Justice strives to be impartial, consistent, and redemptive when it can be. But vengeance is reactive. It's emotional. It's about satisfying pain with more pain. When we execute someone, especially in a flawed system riddled with racial bias, economic inequality, and human error, we risk tipping dangerously into the realm of revenge disguised as justice. And revenge is not a virtue. It's not a foundation to build a proud system on. It's a fire, and fire doesn't build, it burns. A system that's only as strong as its weakest link. Let's be honest, our criminal justice system is not perfect. We know this, we've seen it. People are wrongfully convicted. People are disproportionately punished based on their race, class, or mental capacity. Some communities live in fear of the very system that's supposed to protect them. And yet the death penalty gives that system the ultimate power, the power to end a life. Should an imperfect system be trusted with such a final, irreversible punishment? Because once the gavel falls, there are no do-overs, no apologies, no bringing someone back. A proud justice system is one that acknowledges its fallibility and designs itself around that truth. It chooses caution over certainty, mercy over haste, and dignity over brutality. What are we trying to achieve? Let's remember what a justice system is actually for. It's not just about punishing wrongdoers. It's about protecting society. It's about rehabilitating when possible. It's about upholding the values we claim to cherish: fairness, equality, compassion, and truth. So when we execute someone, especially when there's no proof it deters crime more effectively or that it provides closure any better than life without parole, we have to ask, what are we really achieving and what are we sacrificing in the process? Because a justice system that kills to show killing is wrong might not be sending the message it thinks it is. A system that evolves. A proud justice system is not one that clings stubbornly to traditions out of fear of looking soft. It's one that has the courage to grow, to examine itself, to course correct when it realizes it's doing harm. We've done it before. We ended segregation. We reformed child labor laws. We reversed wrongful convictions with DNA evidence. We acknowledged that mental illness and trauma should matter in courtrooms. Why stop evolving now? If justice is to mean anything at all, it must be rooted in the ability to change when we know better. And we do know better. We know that the death penalty isn't applied equally. We know that mistakes happen. We know that some people sit on death row for decades with no real closure for the victims' families or the public. We know that it doesn't bring back the dead. And we know that most of the world, including our democratic allies, has walked away from it and hasn't looked back. A higher standard, so what kind of justice system do we want to be proud of? One that exacts revenge or one that upholds dignity? One that kills because it can, or one that chooses restraint because it should? One that mirrors our worst instincts, or one that reflects our highest ideals? It's easy to say, some people deserve to die. But it's harder to admit that the system doesn't always get it right. And it's even harder to accept that state-sanctioned killing doesn't fix the original wrong. It just creates another one. Maybe the justice system we should be proud of isn't the one that kills in our name. Maybe it's the one that refuses to because it believes we can be better than the crimes we punish. The bigger picture. The death penalty doesn't just impact criminals. It affects jurors who live with the weight of their decision, victims' families who wait decades for justice that never feels complete, innocent people who are wrongly accused and sentenced, taxpayers who foot the enormous bill, and ultimately, a nation that has to decide what kind of power it gives itself. The world is watching, our children are watching, history is watching. Will we continue to be a country that kills to prove a point? Or will we finally ask ourselves a deeper question? What kind of justice makes us better? Not just as a system, but as a society. This is Cluster Fudge. I'm Alexandra, and whether you agree or disagree with everything we talked about today, I leave you with this one final thought. A society should be judged not by how it treats its best, but by how it treats its worst. The death penalty isn't just about justice, it's about identity. And who we choose to be starts now.